Today's lectionary is a kind of theological smorgasbord. We have everything, lots of rich, tasty morsels from the suffering of Job and that high theology in Hebrews, and a little bit about divorce and adultery and little children and the kingdom. So lots to kind of look at. And Sundays like this, the preacher will sometimes just preach on the collect of the day. So I was kind of wondering, what we might gain from this. And we have these wonderful props from last night. And I want to talk about marriage. And sometimes marriage does involve little children and divorce and adultery and suffering. So it's all kind of woven in there. But I've never preached on a Sunday morning on marriage. And it's an institution that many of us are committed to and involved in. And it's worth kind of exploring as a community. And I think about Mae West's wonderful phrase. She said, marriage is a wonderful institution, but I ain't ready to be put in that institution yet. In my history with marriage and weddings and the church begins as a teenager. I'm 14 years old, and my cousin Sandra is getting married to this lovely Scotsman, Ian Dawson, in the church that I was baptized in, and we were not churchgoers. So going to this wedding, being invited by my cousin, was a kind of beginning of a journey in faith for me. And I was intrigued by the beauty of this beautiful Gothic building and the liturgy and the moment of transformation that was going on. And it's interesting because I started going to church then. I started kind of going back and found, and I didn't realize at the time that I was also exploring my vocation, that I didn't know that part of my work as a priest would be creating these kind of transformational moments for people in their lives. And probably next to childbirth and being beside a deathbed, there is no more transformational moment than a wedding. That couple come in the door, they do their little magic dance and they say their vows, and they are never the same again. Even if that relationship doesn't make it, they are transformed by that moment. And so that story of the first miracle of the wedding in Cana of Galilee, the changing of the water into wine, I don't care about how he did it, but a wedding is as miraculous and transformational as that story. And so anyway, I'm trained as a priest, and I have a wonderful mentor. Norman Barr is my first rector, and so I do my first wedding, and I do my first wedding in the same parish church where my parents were married, 1952. And it's a friend from school, and he marries his sweetheart, and we find out the marriage doesn't lasts a year, and we find out that she's having an affair with the local undertaker for 6 months. So not a very good beginning of my in the wedding business, in the marriage business. This was not a good beginning, and I didn't take it too personally. And then you learn as a priest, what happens when, that moment when you ask the congregation, if there's anybody here who has any reason or impediment why these two persons, they shouldn't get married. Last night, it was funny, the bride, the first time ever, she went, no, no. But it's that kind of very nervous moment in the congregation. So my boss told me, he said, well, there was a time when somebody did object. And what do you do? And so they had to stop the ceremony, and they all went into the vestry, and they had a kind of mini Perry Mason moment to figure out what was really going on. And then he decided that there weren't really any grounds for this, and the service continued. So I learned a lot from him about how to kind of deal with those awkward moments in liturgies and celebrations and so on. And so for many years, preparing people for marriage, I trained as a counselor. There's a program called Prepare Enrich that's been around for about 40 years. And it's managed to keep up with the changes in marriage. It has courses for people who are coming from divorced relationships, so the blending of families. It has gay and lesbian marriages and so on. So this program is really quite wonderful, and I trained in that, and I love doing that. So you're preparing couples not only for the ceremony, but you're preparing them for the relationship. And I see that, there's a part of the service where we ask the congregation, will you do all in your power to uphold these persons in their marriage? And we say we will. And I see that is our responsibility as a faith community to these often young people who are beginning this journey. And I take it very seriously, and so on. So over the years, many, many wonderful, intimate experiences. You have this very intimate moment, and you're eyeball to eyeball with these people, and it's the kind of letting go of the past and going into an unknown future. And I can remember, I reflect over my ministry, the first ever gay couple, 1984, and it was still illegal, it was still controversial, and Lyle and Daryl, and Lyle had lost his daughter 2 weeks before this marriage. It was very kind of poignant. And another moment when I was working people dying of AIDS, I remember marrying a gay couple on the deathbed of one of the partners. Really poignant moments when you're invited into the center, into the heart of people's lives, and how we see how this noble institution is being renewed and recommitted to and brought alive again in the lives of ordinary people. God comes to us in flesh and blood and love, often in a distressing disguise. And in the last 10 years, working in that very controversial arena of marriage equality. And it was very interesting as a priest, as a gay priest, that I had, the state and the church had given me the authority to celebrate marriages, but I wasn't allowed to celebrate my marriage, to marry the person that I loved until relatively recently. So I would always remind the congregation, when I was marrying heterosexual couples, that this was not a right, this was a privilege, that not everybody had this privilege. And there was a kind of sense in which people forgot that or didn't know that. And it was interesting because I really valued, because of my experience, I really valued, in a kind of different way, by being outside, looking in at how important this particular liturgy and the way in which the state and the church are kind of playing a game, playing a role together, and a very important role. In the midst of that debate on equality, gay marriage, there was a very interesting book written by Nancy Cott, who was professor of history at Harvard. And she was actually a witness at the Supreme Court in California, giving witness to the history of marriage in this country. And we had evangelical leaders like Rick Warren would stand up and say, marriage has been the same for 5,000 years. And so we can't have same-gender couples getting married. And clearly, if you look at the Bible and you look at history, that's not been the case. And Nancy Cott's book, I really recommend it if you want to look at how this gentle revolution in our understanding of the relations between human beings and how we commit to love and the ways in which in this country that has evolved is really quite fascinating. And she traces in this country from the origins of the revolution, it was marriage as an institution that this new emerging state kind of latched onto to begin a kind of identity of this emerging America. And part of it was an understanding that in the Declaration of Consent, the woman would consent to be ruled by the husband in the same way that the subject would be ruled by the state. So our understanding of this, what was considered, a personal relationship, suddenly had a larger effect upon our understanding of being part of a country. There are chapters on the Mormons, polygamy, the sexual outlaws of their day, and how the state dealt with that, and how they had to come into line to be recognized as citizens and recognized as a state. There's a chapter on the African American community, which is fascinating. What happens if you consider someone who is not human, kind of half beast, half human, and they're not allowed to get married because you don't marry your animals, right? And what happens when they have children? So the African American story of how we in this country dealt with marriage is also fascinating. And the ways in which the African American community created their own liturgies where they were married but not recognized by the church or the state. Fascinating.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you tell us the title of the book?
The title of the book is Public Vows by Nancy Cott. And I'll leave it here so that you can get it. Really, really fascinating. But again, the idea that this institution is evolving and changing and meeting and still is serving, even though our divorce rate is something like 41% of couples, my commitment and the church's commitment is to ensure that people have the tools to be able to live out their vows faithfully. And I see that as part of our commitment. Another resource that I found very helpful in this kind of soup, as we are trying to kind of reinvent and broaden the circle of and redefine what marriage means for the 21st century, is from a very unusual source. It's from a Roman Catholic nun who's almost 80 years old. Her name is Professor Margaret Farley, and she was the Stark Professor of Christian Ethics at Yale, a Sister of Mercy. And over her academic life, she was the first woman professor, I think, full-time at Yale Divinity School. She received 13 honorary degrees for her work on sexual ethics and justice. And she spent a lot of time, and I really, because of my connections with Africa, I realized how significant this was. She was spending a lot of time in Africa with nuns and women, ensuring that they would get degrees, go to university, and that the whole issue of sexual ethics in Africa, which is a whole different ballgame, was kind of looked at. Last night when we did the wedding, what's very interesting in this country is a man and a woman come to the altar as equals before God. That is still the exception around the world, even in the Christian community. In Africa, part of the patriarchal system, women are still the property. In our culture, we have this thing about the father gives the bride away, even though slavery has been abolished in this country for a long time. But we still kind of connect with that. In Africa, it's real, that you are the possession and you're given to another man and your property. And the women, they do all the work. They farm the land. They don't own the land. And they're responsible for bringing in the food. So Margaret Farley's work, and that she begins to see that love and marriage is both part of the problem, but how do you redeem it? And her answer is to introduce the concept of justice. And it's very interesting. We don't think of justice in marriage or love. And Farley would say, our society, there is no agreed definition of marriage in society or in the church. You can be married by an Elvis lookalike in a hot tub in jacuzzi in Las Vegas, and it's still a marriage, right? So there isn't any agreement. And she said, Scripture is also not helpful because it's got everything from polygamy to that women in Genesis, women are created for kind of man's plaything and to serve him. And occasionally there'll be stories of, like Ruth and Naomi, of women who are outsiders who do very significant things to save creation, to save the planet, and that God's work is in them. And so she asked rhetorically, is sacramental marriage about maintaining a conventional stability, or is it a radical witness to the mystery we call love, the mystery we call God? Is sacramental marriage about maintaining a conventional stability, or is it a radical witness to the mystery we call love? And so she embarks on this very helpful kind of redefinition of the Catholic understanding of sacramental marriage. And you know that she's getting into the truth of something when the Vatican bans your book. You know that you're onto something. And I met her in Ireland when I was studying at Trinity, and she was amazing. And the Irish bishops were very uncomfortable about her being there. And she would say, I respect the Pope, I respect the Church's teaching, but here's what I think. And I'm a theologian, and I can present my position. And as an Anglican Protestant, we have two sacraments. We have baptism and we have Eucharist. And she convinced me that marriage is actually a sacrament. It is this manifestation of an inward presence, an inward sign of an outward grace. And so she convinced me that it's sacramental. So she gives a kind of framework that I found really helpful, and that I shared last night with the community and with the couple, about what those principles, if you're going to kind of, in reforming and reinventing the institution of marriage. So she takes this old medieval, these are Catholic principles of a sacramental marriage, and she gives them a 21st century look. And the first principle is self-determination, right? Is this relationship affirming who I am as an individual, what it means to be my person rather than being scooped up in another person's agenda? Part of the Mark text today, when Jesus is talking about divorce, he's talking about a very different type of divorce than our divorce. He's talking about when a man can just say, okay, you're out of here. And Jesus is saying, no, we are connected. We have a responsibility. It is a divine connection that we have. And divorce, that kind of divorce is wrong. You cannot treat another human being like that. And then he talks about a person must leave their father and mother and be joined, and the two become one flesh. That text has also been misinterpreted and misused, weaponized. The two become one. Which one do they become? And so this principle of self-determination is really important, and a way in which we interpret Jesus' words in Mark. It is not the individual, that you're not lost in the relationship. It's very dangerous in a marriage if you are totally absorbed by the other person. And the pillars of the temple must always stand apart. And healthy marriages do that. I've seen that, and I try to practice that in my own marriage. That you don't lose your individuality in marriage. And the second principle follows on from this, is respecting the autonomy of the other. Free consent to enter into this relationship of love and mutuality. And this involves, Farley would say, truth-telling and promise-keeping. And there was a survey that I read about, it's one of the big problems in a marriage is often failure to deal with money. It's one of those problems that come up. And there was something, a third of the people surveyed, they said that their partner did not disclose, or they deliberately misled them about the financial situation of the other. So one of the principles that Farley would say is, how can you enter into a covenant of marriage when you don't know the whole story? So truth-telling and promise-keeping are really important as a principle. The third principle is equality of power. And she would say that this is important because it both protects the vulnerability of each partner as well as allowing for the possibilities of future growth. That's really profound. If we don't often think about equality, we think about it even in our country right now, because this is a huge issue. This was written long before Me Too. right? So the reason why we should go for equality of power, it's because it protects our vulnerability as well as allowing for our potential growth as individuals and as a country. It's important that we do that. And we are entering this kind of new terrain as a society we're moving into. There is a quiet revolution going on, and the Me Too movement is a part of that. And the abuse of power by men, and you see the kind of end of white male privilege and all the attempts to rampart up those privileges and those assumptions. We see that happening in our world and in our country today. And there is a different understanding of what it means to be men and women, boys and girls, and even an understanding of people who don't identify with that binary way of looking at gender. So it is a very quiet revolution that is happening, but we are still deeply divided on this. And our understanding of marriage, and this framework of a sacramental marriage is really helpful. Because marriage is one of the most important institutions where the gender differences and the gender kind of energy is transformed into something where all the boats can rise. The fourth principle is commitment. We are committed to an enduring love and open to the possibilities of future where we continue to learn and grow to be faithful and hopeful. The image I used last night of the couple was that they were entering into this kind of beautiful new path that they left here at the beginning of a new journey. And it was like walking through this forest as they went out into the world. And the final principle I found really, really helpful was redefining the Catholic sacramental idea that marriage, to be a real marriage, it has to be fruitful. And in traditional Catholic terms, that has meant one thing, right? It's meant having children. And that has diminished the institution of marriage. The people who decide not to have children or cannot have children feel that their marriage is second class. And Farley takes that and does this very kind of creative, ingenious thing. She said, to be a sacramental marriage, it might be that God blesses you with children, but it might be that your vocation is to care for other people's children. Or it might be that you support institutions that care for children, or it might be that your marriage is fruitful in another way. But your marriage has to be fruitful if it's to be sacramental. And she would argue there are many Catholic marriages that are not sacramental. So that's an example of how the circle is widened to include people who have been excluded. And I think of people in our community, people who are divorced. Again, this text has been used and weaponized to beat up on people who have great difficulty in coming to terms with relationships that did not last and that died. Till death us do part. Maybe the death is the relationship. And I found it really kind of moving that people actually want to do that again, but often go into it with much more experience and their eyes open, and marriage is not so romanticized, it's not idealized. And so I've got great sympathy for people who remarry. And I think it's important that we do that. And part of the church, again, doesn't allow that. And the stigma that's often associated with that. So what Farley does is she takes this traditional teaching and she widens the circle. And it's grace-filled. It's wonderful. So 5 guidelines for a sacramental marriage. Self-determination, respect, equality of power, commitment, and fruitfulness. Really powerful. I close with something that I wrote for Philip and Arlen last night. The golden leaves fall like confetti, making a path for your journey. inviting you to an unknown future. The golden leaves fall from the tree, its connection to all that gives life, source, and beginning. We learn the difficult lesson of letting go and be carried by the spirit and winds of love. We must leave father and mother and cleave to another. We become a new creation. The single self was yesterday. We stand in the shadow between what was old self and the new creation of that mystery we call God, who is making in each one of us. Amen.